There was a time when you could drive hundreds of miles and still feel like you were almost home, even when you'd never been to that town before.
The towns looked different on the highway, sure. Different signs, different storefront names, but the rhythm was strangely familiar. On Sunday mornings, you'd hear the church bell carry through the air like a promise.
You'd see kids on bicycles, small figures threading through neighborhoods until the light faded. You'd notice people waving from front porches, as if the street itself was an old friend.
And when you stopped, at a diner, a barber shop, a grocery store, someone would look up and recognize your place in the world. Not because you were famous, because community had a way of making strangers feel seen.
You could tell it by the little things. The barber knew your name, not in a scripted sales way, more like you were part of the town's memory. The grocery store owner asked about your family, the way you might ask about the weather. People didn't rush past each other.
They talked. They asked what you'd been up to, how things were going, what you needed. And if you were new, there was still a sense that you didn't have to figure everything out alone. Nobody acted like those small traditions would vanish someday. Nobody expected the distance between people to grow so fast.
And yet, many of those traditions quietly faded away, piece by piece. Some folks miss the old buildings. Some miss the old cars. But if you're honest, you probably miss the feeling that small-town life gave you, the sense that everyday moments were stitched together. That same street had the same faces, that the town kept a steady calendar in the background. Bells, meals, games, seasons, and you could count on it. Today, you might visit places that still look similar, but the connection feels thinner. Like the town is still standing, but the warmth inside it has moved somewhere else.
One of the oldest traditions was the front porch. And it wasn't decoration. It was a working part of daily life. You didn't sit there just to be outdoorsy. You sat there because life flowed through that space. After supper, families gathered with hands still smelling faintly like cooking. Neighbors leaned in close enough to catch every word without raising their voices. Children played in the yard nearby, and adults talked as if they had all the time in the world. Because, in a real sense, they did. Nobody needed an appointment to stop by.
If the porch light was on, you knew something friendly was happening. On certain nights, you could almost map the town by the porch conversations. Someone would discuss a school play. Someone would mention a cousin who'd been sick and ask if they were better. Someone else would complain about the latest weather. But it wouldn't be the kind of complaining that sucked the air out of the room. It would be the kind that invited solutions.
Even silence felt comfortable. A porch meant you didn't have to perform. You just had to show up. And if you were lucky, you'd hear a laugh that didn't sound practiced, just familiar. Then there was the local grocery store, where shopping wasn't a race against a timer. You walked in and you were greeted like you belonged to the town's story. People talked while they shopped. They compared notes about what was selling well, what was growing, what was in short supply. You would hear someone ask about your family, what school year you were starting, how your kids were doing, whether an older relative was feeling strong. Sometimes the conversation lasted longer than the shopping. That wasn't a problem. It was the point. The store wasn't only selling food. It was keeping the community fed with conversation, too. Children learned a different kind of freedom there, too. After breakfast, they disappeared outside the way birds lift off, quick, bright, and full of purpose. Bicycles rolled down the sidewalk. Fishing poles appeared near the creek or pond, lines cast with serious hope. Baseball gloves got worn smooth from practice that didn't require a schedule. And when you looked outside, you could tell the neighborhood was watching, even when it didn't look like it was. Street corners felt safer because everyone knew who belonged there. When the streetlights came on, the sound changed. Less laughter, more calling from doorways. Parents worried, sure, but they worried inside a net of eyes. Sunday had traditions all its own, and it shaped the whole week like a gentle hand on the calendar. Families dressed carefully, not because they were chasing perfection, but because church and respect went together. Many folks attended church, and after the service, relatives visited one another. You'd hear doors open and close.
You'd smell Sunday dinner, something warm and steady that made you feel like the day had a center. Grandparents told stories that had been told before, but somehow the details felt new each time. Children played outside because the air wasn't rushed. Sunday moved at a slower pace, and that slowness wasn't laziness. It was intentional, almost like a pause button for the soul.
Then there was an unwritten tradition about new neighbors, the kind you don't forget because it touches something basic. A family moved into town and someone knocked on the door.
Maybe it was a piece of pie, bright and sweet, or fresh bread that still steamed when you tore it open. Maybe someone brought garden vegetables picked at the right moment, when they were tender and full of flavor. The message wasn't, "We're being polite." The message was, "You're not alone."
It was the town saying it wanted that new family to feel at home before they even knew the streets by heart.
Harvest season brought another custom, one that felt practical and also deeply human. Gardens often produced more food than one family could eat. Extra tomatoes, corn that needed careful shucking, beans that kept coming day after day, apples that sat in baskets like little trophies of effort. And when there was extra, it didn't become clutter. It became sharing. Food traveled from house to house without the awkwardness some people associate with charity. It wasn't a performance. It was simply expected, like watering the plants or taking the trash out.
In that kind of town, abundance didn't just mean you had more, it meant you had more to give.
Summer evenings carried their own kind of magic. Ice cream trucks came down the road like a moving festival, tinny music announcing joy before anyone even opened the freezer. Fireflies blinked in the grass, turning yards into small galaxies. Porch swings creaked gently as adults rested after a long day. Baseball played on the radio in the background, the voices of announcers weaving through conversation. Families sat outside because the weather invited it. Yes, but also because they liked the fact that the night wasn't private. The evening belonged to everyone, and you could feel it when you stepped outside and heard laughter drifting through the dark. Holiday time stretched those connections across the whole community. Parades filled Main Street, and you couldn't just watch, you became part of it. Flags hung from windows like bright punctuation marks. School bands played music that made even adults stand straighter, as if the rhythm belonged in their bones.
Children rode bicycles decorated in red, white, and blue, weaving carefully through the crowd, waving with the kind of confidence only kids have. It wasn't just celebration, it was recognition. The town reminded itself, together, that it was more than the sum of individual houses. It was a shared identity, stitched by tradition.
Some customs were even more quietly heroic, especially the ones tied to older neighbors. When someone got older, the town didn't wait for that person to ask for help. Grass got cut, snow got shoveled, groceries got carried, tools appeared where they were needed, and hands showed up without a big announcement.
The help wasn't about making anyone look good. It was about making sure nobody felt forgotten. In small-town America, older people weren't pushed to the edges. They stayed at the center of the moral imagination. Like everyone understood that time gives and time takes, and both deserve care.
Even local diners had traditions that weren't written on menus. Waitresses knew regular customers the way you know the tune of an old song. Coffee cups stayed full because somebody paid attention. Conversations didn't always stay in one place either.
A story would start at one table and drift quietly toward the next, as if the room itself was listening. Friendships often began over breakfast when the day was still young and nobody had anywhere they were rushing to be. A diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place to belong.
You didn't come out of the meal feeling fed only in your stomach. You came out feeling fed socially, like your spirit had gotten a little nourishment too.
And if you ever sat in a barber chair, you already know how community shows up there. Haircuts were only part of the reason people walked in. Stories were another part. Jokes, town news, friendly debates that never turned into cruelty.
You'd hear the latest about a game, a candidate, a new shop, a family's new baby, everything that mattered locally. The barber shop functioned like an informal bulletin board, but it worked because people weren't pretending they cared. They genuinely did. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, and even newcomers felt the temperature of that care as soon as they spoke.
Autumn brought football games, and that season had a special way of turning streets into stadiums. Friday nights gathered entire towns together. You'd see parents and grandparents bundled up in their team's colors. You'd see students whose homework could wait because tonight belonged to the bleachers. Neighbors filled the seats, and somehow the air itself felt louder, like cheers were part of the weather. Winning mattered, of course, but spending time together mattered even more. When you watched a game in a small town, you weren't only watching athletes. You were watching families support each other, watching young people become adults in front of everyone, watching a community reinforce its own sense of purpose.
Winter changed the rhythm again, and it didn't shut people down. It tested them and then revealed what they learned. Children built snowmen with faces made from whatever was handy: buttons, sticks, a scarf that probably belonged to someone older.
Families gathered around fireplaces, sharing warmth with the kind of closeness that makes conversation easier. After storms, neighbors checked on one another.
You'd see porch lights brighten, cars move slowly down the road, doors open and close as people made sure nobody was stuck or alone. Warm meals traveled across icy streets in containers that probably weren't fancy but carried real care. Winter wasn't only cold weather, it was proof that community could adapt. Then spring arrived, bringing the urge to begin again. People planted gardens, as if the season itself might answer their efforts.
They cleaned front yards, swept away last year's mess, and reset the appearance of home. Fences got painted, windows got opened after long winters, letting in air that smelled like possibility. You could feel people watching the changes outside because they wanted the inside of their lives to change too.
The happiness didn't come from ignoring hardship. It came from appreciating simple progress, seeing green return, hearing birds again, and knowing the days were moving forward in a way that made sense. Of course, small-town America was never perfect. You don't have to romanticize it to understand why people miss it. People worked hard. Money could be tight. Jobs didn't always appear when you wanted them to.
Life brought real challenges: illness, accidents, loss, and worry. But many traditions helped make difficult times easier, not by erasing pain, but by surrounding it with support.
When a tough month came, communities didn't shrug and move on. They stood together. Families looked after one another. Neighbors became lifelong friends. Because connection wasn't something you scheduled, it was something you practiced.
So maybe that's why you remember those old traditions with affection. Not because the past had no problems. The past had plenty. But ordinary people found extraordinary ways to stay connected. A front porch wasn't just wood and paint. It was a place where loneliness had fewer chances to grow. A baseball game wasn't only entertainment. It was a shared heartbeat.
A shared meal wasn't only calories. It was a chance to hear another voice and know you were still part of the same world. A wave across the street wasn't small. It was a signal. I see you. We're in this together. A fresh pie for a new family wasn't just dessert. It was an entry point into belonging.
And maybe some of America's greatest treasures were never famous at all. Maybe they were everyday moments you were lucky enough to live through.
The church bell that made Sunday feel sacred. The barber chair where stories lived between snips. The grocery store counter where people asked about your family and actually listened. The street where kids rode bicycles until dark because the neighborhood felt safe enough to trust them. The harvest table where extra food didn't become waste, it became love.
The diner where coffee stayed full because kindness was routine. The winter road where warm meals showed up anyway. If you've been missing that feeling lately, you're not imagining it. You can't always go back and rebuild the exact same kind of town life,
Not with the way modern schedules run and the way everything feels faster now.
But you can still recognize the pattern. Connection doesn't require perfection. It requires attention. It requires people deciding that community is worth doing. It's choosing to talk a little longer. It's making room for someone new. It's helping without waiting to be asked. It's letting neighbors become friends. It's making traditions out of ordinary days until the ordinary starts to feel like home again.